Okay, so for our last week, I don't know about you, but I've had a lot of fun. This has been, for me, this has been, it's been eye-opening. I didn't know what I would gain from preparing the course, but it's been a lot of fun. So what I wanted to do today is speak about the plagues and figure out what exactly was the purpose of the plagues. And there are really a lot of answers to that question. And the truth is, as you go through the story in the Torah itself, and then you go through the commentaries, you get different implications. And the movies have played up on different themes as well. So if I asked you, what is the purpose of the plagues, right? Or purposes, plural, of the plagues, what would you say? Where are the sources? Sorry, here are the sources. So that's interesting. We try to, right, God hardens his heart so that for some reason the plagues don't work right away, right? That's sort of the...
To prove to him that Hashem exists.
Right. So one, as we'll see, is to educate about God, is to teach Pharaoh about God. What else?
Yeah, that he controls nature.
Right. To teach God. Yes, definitely. Teach Pharaoh that God controls nature.
There's also like the Bnei Israel to show the Pasuk Yad.
One is definitely to educate the Jewish people. These are like the higher, like. I think if I asked my son, right, my 4-year-old, he would tell me, right, I think at some point you realize this isn't the simple answer, even though it seems like the simple answer. But the first answer I would give, even though it's probably is not fully right, is... I would even go further, simpler, punish. I would have said the first thing I would have said just to let them go, right, meaning all the movies, right, let my people go, right? No, I won't let my people go. Okay.
But punishing for what? Because God has his heart, so it's not his fault. How can it be punished?
Right. So this is sort of the complication right there, is that while the first thing I would say is let my people go, right? The hard part about that is God says I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. Once you say you're going to harden Pharaoh's heart, that means you're trying to delay the inevitable of Pharaoh giving in and letting them go, which means that the answer to the plagues is not let my people go. Right? God may want Pharaoh to let them go, but if he wanted that to happen, he could have brought the plague of the firstborns to begin with, or he could have just, flown them out in a magic carpet. The point of the plagues, even though the point of the Exodus is the Exodus, right, sort of tautologically, the point of the plagues per se can't only be getting Pharaoh to let the Jews go, because then why harden his heart? Why delay when he's going to say yes? And that's why there are all these other reasons. So punish them. Punish them for what? So you might be tempted to say, punish him for consistently saying no. But the problem is, again, he's hardening his heart, which leads you to believe that it's not just about that. It might be punishing for... Right, yeah, exactly. For everything until now. Right, for the last few hundred years of subjugation and torture and all of that stuff. And the hardening of the heart is to give you time to punish Pharaoh and the Egyptians for everything that they've done so far. And this is... I put some of the verses here. And the truth is that these aren't mutually exclusive. Number one, right, emphasizes that at least part of it is about let them go, right? Let my people go. I put in brackets the point of them, right? In chapter 3 of Exodus, it says, "Yet I know that the king of Egypt will let you go only because of a greater might. So I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with various wonders, which I will work upon them. After that, he will let you go." Right? God is pretty clear that at least part of it is to encourage Pharaoh to let them go. It's just that, again, that sort of begs the question. If you want them to go, so bring the harshest punishment first. There's clearly at least another goal to it, but part of it is let them go. Which, to be fair, calls into question, right, the sort of that cinematic movement in all the movies, where the climax is always let my people go, let my people go, let my people go, or the introduction, which we saw a few weeks ago, of the Ten Commandments, that this is the story of freedom, right? That the emphasis of the entire story is freedom of the Jews, which is not totally true, right? If you remember, how does the Ten Commandments end? It's sort of funny how it ends, because it's totally out of context, right? It ends, let freedom ring through all the lands, right? Which is a verse in the Torah. It is a pasuk in the Torah, but not in context at all. At all, right? It's a pasuk about Yovel, about the Jubilee, that in the Jubilee year we free all slaves. Right? It has nothing to do with this story. It is a very famous verse. It's on the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, but it has nothing to do with this story. But classically in the movies, the emphasis is primarily let my people go. It's about freedom. But as we've mentioned, that's not what it's about. Part of it is simply revenge or punishment, retribution. And I gave you, for example, in 2, where the verse says, I've said to you, let my son go, that he may worship me. You refuse to let him go. No, I will slay your firstborn son. Right? He says to Pharaoh, you didn't let my firstborn go, so I will kill your firstborn. And many of the Midrashim play up on this notion that, the sources over here, that the punishments are measure for measure, and they go to great lengths to explain why do we have each of the different plagues. Is blood because they threw the babies into the water, and therefore the water was bloodied with them, and the frogs, was it because they kept them up at night, making them do work? They were blowing horns. Some of the Midrashim say the lice was because they wouldn't let them bathe, which meant that they would be infested. And they go through each one trying to figure out why they were punished. And the truth is that in number 3, when God tells Abraham that his children will be slaves, he promises him that at the end I will execute judgment on the nation they shall serve, and in the end they shall go free with great wealth. Right? So he does emphasize that there will be judgment, there'll be punishment. That's only part of the answer. Now, some of that does come across as a bit, as if it's retribution for the sake of retribution. Now, this is a scene we already saw, but just to... Oh, of course, today it works for the first time. They've gone to Torah. Yay! Is this better now that it's coming from the speaker?
Yeah.
Nice of you to come.
Yeah. Okay,
Still you were lost.
Oh, yeah.
This is right before he decrees the death of the firstborn.
I disagree. Something worse has to happen.
I disagree. Anything more would be...
Would be what? What were you about to say? Cruel? Inhumane?
It's not easy to see the people who I grew up with suffering this much.
What about the people you didn't grow up with? What thought did you give to them? You still don't think of them as yours, do you? As long as Ramesses has an army behind him, nothing will change.
Anything more is just revenge!
Revenge! After 400 years of brutal subjugation! These pharaohs who imagine they're living gods, they're nothing more than flesh and blood. I want to see them on their knees, begging for the stop!
I'm tired of talking with a messenger!
Okay, so right in that scene, right, they actually swallow 2 different reasons. Is that better? I mean, this one's the last, this just takes place at night. It's just a dark scene. This is from Gods and Kings. This is Gods and Kings. This is Gods and Kings, right? And he swallows 2 things in here. One is, don't be so upset that it's about revenge. Of course, it's about revenge and punishment. This is built up and built up and built up and built up for hundreds of years. They've killed the firstborns. They've treated the Jews inhumanely. Yeah, sometimes retribution is called for. That's right, and part of the plague story is clearly just that. But then he swallows something else. And he says it's not just about punishment. He also swallows something. He says, these pharaohs who think they're gods. I want to see them on their knees. Right? And part of it, as we've said, is about education. Not necessarily education in, the neutral, sort of positive sense of the word. There is a sort of harshness to it, that part of the education that needs to happen is not just that there is a God, but the reason it was so important to educate the Egyptians, or educate the world, was that the pharaohs thought of themselves as gods. And this is really how the whole story begins. And we saw this scene a few weeks ago, right? But I'll remind you, right? The sort of first scene where Moses goes in to Pharaoh in the Ten Commandments, when he turns this the staff into a snake. There, they actually just quote the verses, right? They don't even play with it. They don't play with the screenwriting. They left the screenwriting up to God, and they just translate it, right? By what force do you come? It says by God of Abraham. Who is this God that I should recognize him? Right, that is just a quote from the verse, which is, Mi Hashem asher yishma b'kolo. Who is God that I should listen to his voice? He is the God, right? Especially Ramses. And I think I mentioned this I think I mentioned this a few weeks ago. But what does Ramses mean in Egyptian? Right?
Son of Ra.
Yeah, the son of Ra, right? Ra Moses. Right, Ra Moses, or Ra Moses, but the son of Ra. The pharaohs are gods. That's what they are. Who is this God? In what pantheon does he exist? I'm a god in the pantheon too. I'm the son of the chief god, of the sun god. I don't care about your God. So it isn't just education. It's a specific battle with the theology of Egypt in which human beings are gods, in which the pharaoh is God. And that is and we don't even notice this, but we say this over and over in Haggadahs. We say it in Dayenu. As we're going through the list in Dayenu, we say, Ilu asa vahem shvatim. If we had judgment against them, v'lo asa be'elohehem, but you hadn't taken it out against their gods, Dayenu. But those are two different things. There's judgment, and then there's a totally separate goal in the Exodus story, which is specifically to target the theology of the Egyptians. Now, this is developed very much by Casuto. I didn't put it in the source, but he notes that this is in number 5, and this becomes quite evident, that for that night I will go through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and I'll mete out punishments to all the gods of Egypt. I, the Lord. Right? God says it explicitly. I'm going out not just to punish the Egyptians, but to punish, whatever that means, the gods. And in 6 and 7, we see this right from the beginning. What's the first god that is attacked in the plagues? In the first plague? The Nile. Right? The Nile is a god in Egyptian theology. And the first thing to be hit is number 6. Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. See, I shall strike the water in the Nile with the rod that is in my hand, and it will be turned into blood. And Rashi in 7 tells you that because rain does not fall in Egypt, but the Nile rises and irrigates the land, and the Egyptians on this account worship the Nile. Therefore God first smote their deity, and afterwards smote them. It's not just about them, it's about re-educating them theologically. This one, specifically, the Ten Commandments actually does this one very nicely. Second. This one? Yeah, this one. Okay.
Look! There! Where he struck the river! He bleeds! The water turns to blood!
If you caught that line, God, right? Blood flows from the God, right?
He is blood.
7 times 7 days. No magician's trick will set your people free. Sacred water, make pure the flood from which you came.
Right? And that's what they're drawing on, right? This isn't just, right? The movies actually do a very nice job here. That it's not just against Egypt, right? Blood flows from the god, right? And Pharaoh is convinced he can undo it with magic, but he can't. He drops it. There's this emphasis that sometimes we miss, that the Exodus was not just about getting the Jews out. It wasn't just about freedom. It wasn't even just about punishment. And it isn't even just about education generally, that God is powerful. The problem really is as follows. In the ancient world, they didn't believe in a God, they believed in gods, plural. If you attack them and win once, all they're going to think is, your God is a more powerful member of the pantheon. The gods were always fighting. Right? Everything was always explained by which god had the upper hand. It's not enough to show that God is powerful. He has to systematically attack God after God after God after God, because otherwise the message isn't going to get across. Not just that God is a God. Not just that God is a powerful God. Not just that God is the most powerful God. But that the whole notion of a God among gods is flawed. And you need to have a systematic education where you go God for God and you, right? Yeah.
Now it's just share though. He's I mean, it's like you're admitting that almost.
Right. So that's interesting, right?
We're doing comparative value of our Hashem to other gods. So
So mi chamocha ba'elim. So that's interesting because el can mean God. It can also mean forces, right? And mi can mean who, or it can be rhetorical. Right? It can be a rhetorical question. Right? So that sentence we read many ways. Right? Who is among you? Who is as great among you? Right? I mean, no one. Or it's like, yeah, who is among you amongst those gods? Quote, right? Are there quotations? Right? Is it forces? Right? What does that mean? You're right. Meaning, it's sort of right. It can be read in a
comparative.
Yes, right, as God being the head of the pantheon. You're right, but the general thrust, right? This is always the problem, right? Is that sometimes we do talk in that way. God is greater than the gods, even though what we mean is there are no other gods. You see that in I'm teaching this now in another class, but I love this story where Eliyahu, right, Elijah is on Har Carmel, and he has the face-off with the 450 prophets of Baal, and all day long they're trying to get the magic to the magic fire to come down from heaven, and he just makes fun of them. Maybe your gods are sleeping. Maybe they've gone on vacation. Maybe you should scream louder because they can't hear you. Meaning, yes, if you want to be a polytheist, then you can take that seriously. Oh, maybe he is sleeping. When clearly Elijah isn't saying maybe your gods are sleeping because he believes they're gods, they're just sleeping. He means to highlight the absurdity. But sometimes you speak in their language and then it gets confusing. But you're right? There are definitely verses that get confusing this way. Okay. It was my wife, but it was not her telling me that she's in labor. So, okay, that's fine. This I think, I didn't put this on the sources, but at what point? There is a point before the 10th plague, actually, where Pharaoh gives in. Not just where he says go. There is a moment at which Pharaoh gives in, theologically. Like he actually admits he's wrong. And that's after the 7th plague, after hail. Pharaoh actually says that God, right, Hashem, hu ha-tzaddik, God is the righteous one, v'ani v'ami ha-rishayim, and I and my people are evil. And then after that he retracts again, and that's when there seems to be a turning point in the plagues. The first 7, God is less vicious to him. Starting in the 8th, God says that the point of the plagues are just to humiliate Egypt. But there seems to be a moment of clarity after the 7th plague. Now the reason seems to be because it was the first plague that didn't just show that God was stronger than the other gods, but that God was above the pantheon. Because what was unique about the hail? It had fire in it. According to the verses, it was fire and water. Now, in the pantheon, that doesn't make sense, because the fire god and the water god are always at odds with each other. If fire and water come down together, that means that the god you're contending with isn't in the pantheon, but above the pantheon. Right? Is above the gods, because he can get the gods to work together, quote unquote. Right? So that seems to be the moment where Pharaoh, for a moment, has clarity. Now, the Midrashim, though, really play up at this idea. I gave you an 8 from Targum Yonatan, Targum really pseudo Jonathan, but whatever. This is what the Midrash says happened the night of the 10th plague. Right? We remember the verse in number 5. It said that God will punish all the gods. So the Targum says as follows: "And I will be revealed in the land of Mitzrayim, and the majesty of my glory this night, and with me 90,000 myriads of destroying angels, and I will slay all the firstborn in the land of Mitzrayim, of man and of beast, and against all the idols of the Egyptians I will execute 4 judgments. The molten idols shall be melted, the idols of stone be broken, the idols of clay shall be shattered, and the idols of wood be made dust." And I don't know who translated this. I took it from online. That the Mitzri, the Egyptians, may know that I am the Lord. And Rashi quotes this as well, that they take it literally. God goes to the country, and as he's going, not only are the firstborns dying, but the idols are collapsing. Right? He's actively waging war on the idols. Now the Torah Aruch quotes from Nachmanides in 9, and this comes back to Morris's point. He suggests that maybe there actually are forces up in the heavens. There are not gods per se, but angelic forces, and God is actually fighting these angels. He's overpowering these angels that belong to Egypt. Right? So he writes in 9, Nachmanides therefore proposes the following. Mention of the deities of the Egyptians refers to the respective representatives at the heavenly throne of the people of Egypt. Their mazal, right? Their zodiac. That God is actually waging war in heavens against the Elim, against their forces. Not because they're gods, but because maybe there are supernatural forces that God is waging war again. But as the Rashbam notes, you don't have to say that. You could just say that because the Egyptians had put their trust in these deities, God had to demonstrate their utter helplessness to help themselves, much less those who worship them. It was an indirect response to Pharaoh's insolence and asking, who is Hashem? Who is God? Right, that seems to be the undercurrent here. That in addition to punishing the Egyptians, God is waging a war with their theology. Now as you go through, what I put for the rest here of the sources is that classic sources, Midrashim and the like, they basically got as far as I just did. Right? That one of the themes in Egypt was fighting the gods of Egypt. Right? They would emphasize specifically the Paschal offering, right, which took the sheep, which was a god of Egypt. But one of the things that's been fascinating about sort of Egyptology, about Egypt studies, is that we get a much sharper perspective. Because it's not just, God is fighting the gods of Egypt. We actually get a pretty good notion of which gods he's fighting and why the plagues develop as they do with sort of terrifying detail. Because the more we learn about their gods, the more we realize this isn't just like vague. Each of the plagues is very, very, very specific. Now, I don't know if they knew about this or not, but just to show you, the movies did pick up on this a bit. This is from when Pharaoh decides to change his mind. Right? He first tells Moses that you can go, but then he changes his mind. And this is what happens.
Slaves on the desert.
And I just want to show you something. Now, it's really just this. If you notice, you know what's going on in the background? I couldn't find online the whole scene for this, but what's going on right here in the back? You see where his son is?
On the altar.
So it's not an altar, it's actually on the idol itself of I think this is Horus. I think they said this is Horus, meaning the god of the dead.
Yes.
Right? And he's actually, right before this moment, he's praying to Horus and saying, show your power over God, right? Over the God of Moses. And they're actually very good at highlighting this. There's a constant interplay that here he is, his son is on the God, right? He wants his God to prove the power over his God, and that's mixed in weirdly with his ego, right? Because he walks away from his God and changes his mind when she says, I hear the laughter of slaves, right? And then, he continues.
Laughter! My son, I shall build your tomb upon their crushed bodies. If any escape me, their seed shall be scattered and accursed forever. I am Warcry.
Right, and there's this mix, right, of pride and theology going on, which the movies capture, right? There's two things at the moment. I like it, right? He has his son on the God, right, and how he's going to fight for his son. He's going to fight for his God, mixed in with ego, right? He fights for those two things, to protect for revenge. Well, three things really. Revenge, pride, and so that his God should overpower the God of Israel. That could bring his son back, right? There's this whole scene right before here, him praying to Horus to prove his superiority. And this is really the complex that's mixed up throughout the story. I gave you in 12 here that Norman Fredman has an article in Tradition, 1984, where he puts it very nicely. That the 10 plagues had begun with God not accepted in the Egyptian pantheon. They end the same way, because now that pantheon is no more. And now Egypt is ready to be punished for killing God's firstborn son. Right? At this point, right, by the time you get to the 10th, God has systematically attacked every one of their gods. At this point, if you give in, then you've given in. Right? That's it. It's all over. And to be fair, that is in fact how it ends. Right? He goes, in one last-ditch effort, Pharaoh goes to try to fight with the God of Israel, to prove that his theology means something. And then this happens.
Couldn't even kill him.
His God is God.
Right, that's like a great, very short scene, right? That what is the ultimate defeat at the end, right? You couldn't even kill him. And the summary of the whole thing is you couldn't even kill him, and all he can say is, his God is God. And then there's the look on their face, right, even still, right, is just great. It's this total defeat. I don't know what to do. But that's what it was. It's slowly, one after another, God picks at their gods. He attacks their theology. He makes one last-ditch effort at the end, and when he loses at the sea, it's clear that the message is not just God is a God, it's his God is God. Period. End of story. That is the entire lesson. It all went for this moment to educate the Jews, the Egyptians, everybody. Right? The whole Torah can be summarized in a 20-second clip from the movie. Right? His God is God. Yeah.
I'm not following number 12. Egypt is ready to be punished for killing God's firstborn son. Which son are we talking about?
Oh, the Jews. The Jews. Right? That God refers to the Jews as B'ni Bechari Yisrael, my son, my firstborn son. Right? And this is that's the specific sort of punishment for it. Now, but since you mention it, right, I'll put it this way. I want to focus a bit on this, and then I'll just sort of go through some of the historical material. Yeah.
Maybe it's not only theological. Even sometimes when Pharaoh see that God is powerful, it's maybe just economic also. He has here hundreds of slaves for free, and just it's a business thing.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is. It definitely is that also. Yeah, no, it definitely. I think this is more in Gods and Kings. They actually play up on that, right? He just but what are we going to do without our slaves, right? We need people to build cities. And there, I think what you need to prove. This is the way many of the European powers were driven out of Africa, right? Was you just need to prove to the powers it's not worth it anymore, right? Meaning if it's economic. So then, as soon as you hit the point where it's just not worth the money anymore, then forget it. We'll pull out, right? It was a gold mine, right? Whatever, all the countries in Africa, right, and countries not in Africa, India, whatever the case may be, at some point, as it became not worth it because of terrorism, right, guerrilla fighting, for international censure, whatever, you just gave up. You're right. Part of it is definitely God is just convincing them it's not worth it, worth it anymore. Debating whether to look at some of the clips or to look. You know what? Okay, let's look at some of the sources here, and then we'll look at a few more clips. But like I said, what I think is fascinating is not just that we can speak about this theoretically. But the more we learn about Egypt, the more we realize, like we did in the first scene with the blood, that these were very calculated attacks, not just against generic forces. So you look here at 14. This is an article published in 1990 by Sioni Zevit. 3 ways to look at the 10 plagues. It's in Bible Review, but it's available, the link right underneath there on biblicalarchaeology.org. So he says as follows. According to this suggestion, the plague of blood, number 1, was directed against the god Khnum. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that, but okay. Creator of water and life. Or against Hapi, the Nile god. Or against Osiris, whose bloodstream was the Nile. Frogs, number 2, was directed against Heket, a goddess of childbirth who was represented as a frog. The pestilence against cattle, number 5, might have been directed against Hathor, the mother and sky goddess represented in the form of a cow, or against Apis, symbol of fertility represented as a bull. Hail, number 7, and locust, number 8, were, according to this explanation, directed against Set, who manifests himself in wind and storms, and or against Isis, goddess of life, who grinds, spins flax, and weaves cloth, or against Min, who is worshipped as a god of fertility and vegetation, and as a protector of crops. Min is an especially likely candidate for these 2 plagues, because the notations in Exodus 9:31 indicate that the first plague came as the flax and barley were about to be harvested, but before the wheat and spelt had matured. A widely celebrated coming out of Min was celebrated in Egypt at the beginning of the harvest. Right? So it's not just vague. The Egyptians had multiple gods of produce, different ones, and we have plagues that hit at the beginning of the harvest season, later in the harvest season, which were 2 different gods in the pantheon. These plagues, in effect, devastated Min's coming out party. Darkness, number 9, pursuing this line of interpretation, could have been directed against various deities associated with the sun. Amon-Re, Aten, Atum, or Horus. And finally, the death of the firstborn, and this is what we saw already in the clip, was directed against the patron deity of Pharaoh and the judge of the dead, Osiris. Additional data from Egyptian religious texts clarifies the terrifying 10th plague. The famous cannibal hymn, carved in the Old Kingdom pyramid of Unas at Saqqara around 2300 BCE, states, "It is the king who will be judged with him whose name is hidden on that day of slaying the firstborn." And you get this sort of list that each of these plagues is calculated. There is a god of the Nile, but there's also a god whose bloodstream is the Nile. And then there's a god who's a frog, and a god who's a cow, and a god who's a lamb, and a god who's of the early harvest, and a god of the late harvest, and a god of death, and a god of the firstborns. Right? Each one of them, you suddenly realize, like that scene we had at the beginning or at the end, there is a specific god that is being attacked. God is very systematic here. It's, okay, we'll take it one by one. Philo, writing, 2,000 years ago in 13, puts this in a slightly different way, and he writes as follows. "For the elements of the universe, earth, water, air, and fire, of which the world was made, were all by the command of God brought into a state of hostility against them, so that the country of those impious men were destroyed, in order to exhibit the height of the authority which God wielded." He said it's very simple. There are 4 powers in the world. There's earth, water, air, and fire. And God systematically goes through the 4 realms of experience, the 4 powers in the world, and he turns them all against God. Against the Egyptians, right? All forces that exist, they all go systematically. So, you start off with blood and frogs, you hit the water, and then you have lice, and you hit the ground, right? The earth itself turns into dust, and then you get the wild animals who are roaming on the earth, and then you have the animals dying, and then you move up. Right? The boils, they're on the human beings, but Moses starts it by throwing the ashes into the wind, which then become the boils, and then you have the hail coming out of the heavens, which is just frozen water with fire, and then you get the locust, where the emphasis they come from the wind, and then darkness, and the heaven itself is darkened. Right? You're hitting every realm of experience, every power, every god, everything. I gave you as well in 15 from John Currid in Ancient Egypt in the Old Testament. He goes through this as well, right? Slightly different versions, right? The opening disaster was clearly directed against the Nile River when its inundation was deified and personified as the Egyptian god Hapi. And then he notes, this is what's bolded at the end of that paragraph, that the river and its god could no longer supply the people's needs. Right, it's not just he's attacking them, but that was in the movie scene, right? They play it up nicely that he strikes at the Nile when Ramses goes to bless the water for a fruitful year. That's the moment you hit. Right? When they emphasize the power of the Nile to provide for the Egyptians, that's when you hit. The frog, the hail, he goes in is a mockery of Nut, who's the female representative of the sky and personification of the vault of heaven, and Shu, the supporter of the heavens who holds up the sky, right? Which is sort of a nice image, right? That they have a god, apparently, whose only job is to hold the sky up and prevent things from falling that shouldn't fall, right? So if you make ice and fire fall out of heaven, it's just a mockery of the god who's meant to hold things in heaven. Right, which is, we don't think about it because we don't have, like the notion that you have a separate God, a God of rain, and a God whose job is just to hold things in heaven. Or we don't understand how much of a mockery it would be of their gods if, you have a God whose job is to hold things in heaven that aren't supposed to come down, and then this unnatural stuff falls out. Fire and water are sort of falling out of heaven mixed together. It's this unnatural, it's a total mockery. And in the end, and this is again what we saw in the movie, in this scene where Pharaoh asks the God to bring his son back, it's a mockery. So here they suggest it's Anubis who has a canine form. Anubis is the god of the dead who has a canine form. I think that's actually what it was, not Horus. It was Anubis, right? It's a big dog holding, right? He's begging Anubis, prove that you're the god of the dead. Bring him back. And it's just a mockery. He even suggests here that when right after the Jews leave, the verse says that as they're leaving, a dog shall not even sharpen its tongue or lap its tongue. Lo yechratz kelev l'sho. No, it won't move its tongue. Well, he said, well, that makes sense, right? You've just humiliated Anubis, the canine god of the dead, because you've killed all their firstborn, and even a dog won't be able to say anything to the Jews, right? Anubis has been silenced. The canine god has been silenced. And forget the godly canine, the godly dog. Even regular dogs are afraid at this point. You've silenced the entire pantheon. But perhaps the most striking of all of these, right, is the one we haven't even discussed. And that is, or we've hinted at, and this is what J.J. Davis notes in his studies of the Exodus in 16, is that the firstborn of Pharaoh was not only successor to the throne, but by the act of the gods was specifically born son having divine property. Right? Perhaps the hardest of the plagues to understand, the harshest of them, is the last one. Right? Is the death of the firstborns. But when you realize this notion, this level, right, that it's not just vengeance, and it's not just to get them to go, but it's to attack their theology. There's one God that has to be struck at hardest, and that's not Anubis and not Horus and not Ra, is Pharaoh, who's divine, and his firstborn son, who is given by the gods and is endowed with the property of being a god. And there's a reason you've got to kill the firstborn son of Pharaoh, because Pharaoh and his firstborn son are the ultimate deities in Egypt. Right? This is like the Ten Commandments throughout. Right? That arrogance that Ramses has. So let it be written, so let it be done. Right? I am the God of Egypt. This is not his invention. He thinks he's God, and his son will be God. So if you're attacking their gods, you almost have to, right? At least take out his firstborn. Him and his firstborn. You almost don't have a choice if you want to attack that final God. Now, right, and it's for that reason that this really crushes him. I mean, obviously it also has an emotional resonance, but it also crushes him because it's the one that highlights that he isn't a god. This is where Pharaoh gives in. Wait, okay. Hold that for a second. Right, before I even get here, if you notice, the scene starts off, right, they do it nicely. This is where you can see that he's deciding to give in. But look how they do it, right? He's actually leaning on an idol, right? It's like this moment, right? When he's going to give in, it captures it. He gives in on behalf of the pantheon, right? I mean, he can no longer rely on it. When he realized there's nothing left, not him and not this God over here. And they build up this scene, right? As you look, right, Moses walks in, and he's surrounded by these statues on every side. Or if you want to see sort of what this means, the theological overtones of this whole thing, he walks in. It's not just he's surrounded by Egyptians. He's surrounded by God after God, God after God.
You have conquered, Moses. The foot of a slave is on the neck of Egypt. You are saved from the Nile to be a curse upon me. Your shadow fell between me and my father, between me and my fame, between me and my queen. Your shadow now fills all things with death. Go out from among us, you and your people. I set you free.
It is not by your word, nor by my hand that we are free, Pharaoh. The power of God has freed us.
Enough of your words. Take your people, your cattle, your God, and your pestilence. Take what spoils from Egypt you will, but go.
O Lord God, with a strong hand thou dost bring us out of bitter bondage. Tomorrow we go forth a free nation, where every man shall reap what he has sown, and bow no knee except in prayer. We will go with our young and with our old, with our sons and with our daughters, with our flocks and with our herds will we go. For I know that the Lord is great, and that our Lord is above all gods.
Right, in this moment, right, I don't know if you ever pay attention to the rhetoric, right, but he comes and he said, it's not you who lets us free, it's God. He says, take your God. And Moses makes this speech, right, now I know that you are God, now, right, all will know that you are God above the other gods, right, but that's really what it's about, right? Yes, it's about getting the Jews to be free, but if it was just about getting the Jews to be free, you don't need 10 plagues. Yes, it's about revenge. But if it's revenge, so just slap them around a bit. I don't know, right? But the way in which he punishes, it may be to get him to convince them to go. It may be that it's to punish them. But it's also a systematic education of the Egyptians as the world superpower. It's an education of the Pharaoh, who thinks he is God, right? If you saw that clip from the beginning, from Gods and Kings, right? These pharaohs who think themselves gods. It was partially against this theology, not just of Egypt, of the whole world, that there were forces and there were powers that you needed to ingratiate, and that the line between God and man was loose, and kings were gods and had divine right to act as gods and do whatever they wanted, and they were answerable to no one. But you want to educate an entire world, not just one civilization, the civilization, right? The most powerful civilization. And remember, in a polytheistic world, if you're the most powerful civilization, the assumption is you have the most powerful gods. That's why you're so powerful. Your gods are helping you over the other gods. If you want to educate the world, there has to be this system, systematically, of attacking the Nile, of attacking the frog god, and the fertility god, and the god of the early harvest, and the god of the late harvest, and the god who holds up the heavens, and the god of the heavens, and the god of the rain, and the god of the fire, and the god of the rain with the god of the fire, and the god of...
They probably have more than 10 gods.
Oh, for sure, they have more than 10. And that's why you see, even in these, right, they say, well, just hitting the Nile could be one of 3 gods, right? It's not just one. I remember many years ago when I was in yeshiva, so this was... whatever it was, a decade plus ago. One of my friends, his father, had noted perhaps one of the most beautiful of these attacks. There is a myth in ancient Egypt that when somebody dies, to figure out whether or not they're going to go to heaven, their heart is weighed, and if their heart is heavier than a feather, well, no, let's start the other way. If their light is lighter than a feather, or as light as a feather, then they go to heaven. And if their light is heavy, if their heart is heavier than a feather, rather, it gets thrown to the crocodile god of death at the bottom of the Nile. That's the myth in ancient Egypt. And he said, that single myth explains like half of what goes on. No, not half, but explains a lot in the story. So for example, the first plague, if blood comes up from the Nile, what would an Egyptian think? That there are a lot of hearts being eaten by the god at the bottom of the Nile. But that means it's saying you are evil. Right? If you say there's blood filling the Nile, that means there's a lot of hearts of Egyptians which have been thrown to the Nile god, who's a crocodile, which means you're evil, right? Because you're bad, right? You deserve to have your hearts in the Nile, right? And he said, furthermore, when the verses say that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, it's actually a mistranslation. It doesn't say harden. The Hebrew is vayichbad, which means he made it heavy. Right? Which in Egyptian theology doesn't mean it hardens. It means he has declared you evil. Right? He's made your heart heavy. He's made it heavier than the feather because the Pharaoh was traditionally the only person who was guaranteed to have his heart weigh the same as a feather. Because he was a god. He would always go to heaven. So his heart was hardened. Right? It was this attack on their theology at every level. And this is review from last week. I gave you again the same quote in 11. It's not just these attacks against the gods. It's I noted last week, the language of the Exodus story, that with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, God takes them out with that. But as we mentioned, in Egyptian royal literature, the mighty hand is a synonym for Pharaoh. Right? It's this notion that the plagues are out-pharaohing the Pharaoh, out-godding the gods, right? It's taking apart their theology at every level to educate them. Now, had they given earlier, maybe God would have stopped. I don't know, right? It sounds like if Pharaoh had overcome his hardened heart and said, "Okay, I get it," he would have let them go. Because, okay, if you learn the lesson after I hit the first 5, 6, 7 gods, then I'll let you go. But I think because the polytheism is so beyond us, so behind us, we forget this sort of layer. The movies bring it back because it's actually, sort of very, right? Cinematically, it's actually great for them, right? You get these scenes with the idols, with Pharaoh, who is a god, being crushed, recognizing God is God. There's something very powerful about it. But that's, I think, something we often forget. At least I don't think about, I sometimes forget about that. I once said this to one of my teachers. He asked me, he's like, what, the fact that at this point there isn't so much polytheism in the world, definitely not in the Western world, so, what do we gain sort of religiously from reading all these texts and having all these laws, anti-idolatry? I told him, look, at a very simple level, if nothing else, the fact that none of this really resonates with us is proof that we won. Right? The fact that for the most part, it's not just Jews, but most people living in America, Canada, who watch the Ten Commandments are rooting for the monotheistic God. And this resonates with them is a testament to how successful the Exodus was and the subsequent thousands of years. The fact that so many cultures can look at this movie and in one way or another, it resonates with them. It's not about Judaism. Right? Monotheism won. Right? This was the beginning of a revolution. Right? It started with Avram, it started with Abraham, but the Egypt story as a story of the victory of monotheism over polytheism. And everything that goes with that. The deification of human beings at the expense of other human beings. Right? The fact that story resonates and that we don't even notice, right, how that we can't even without Egyptology, we don't even understand what it was that God was trying to attack because we've so won, we've moved so past that it's meaningless. Is quite the testament to what God was trying to do. Right? He educated the world so well that 3,500 years later, we don't even understand all the imagery that was there, how systematic of an education it was, because it worked, because it won. Yeah, Morris.
I just wonder, that your concept here, your thesis here, we have no evidence. It took thousands, I'll put it this way, it took thousands of years for monotheism really to catch on. 1500 was about...
Oh, no, for sure. It wasn't like everything was won at this point.
Even the Jews weren't convinced.
No, for sure. It's not like it didn't win after this moment. But,
I'm saying there's no evidence that the Egyptians changed their ways.
Right, so that's an interesting question. Do they ever get it? Correct.
Yonah was much more successful. Like, Yonah went to...
So that's an interesting question, is did it actually work, or didn't it by the end? Now, you pick up on Nineveh and Yonah. It's interesting because there's a reason that the Midrash connects them. Right? The Midrash suggests that the only person who survived the battle at the sea was Pharaoh. And Pharaoh then moved to Nineveh and became the king of Nineveh. Right? That's the Midrash. Right? But that's what the Midrash is picking up on, is exactly what you are saying. Is that the message right, even if the Midrash isn't literal, what it's saying is, you're right. Maybe the Egyptians never got it. But it did set a precedent. Right? It did put a story in the narrative of the world that maybe only manifested itself in pockets in Nineveh hundreds of years later. But when the Midrash says Pharaoh survives and makes it to Nineveh, that this is what he's saying, is that at some level the message carried on. At some level it was successful. Maybe in Egypt it wasn't. But the resonance carries on. And to carry it over to now, the fact that nowadays we look at these movies and we all just feel, right? Not just Jews, everyone just sort of feels that this is absurd. Why didn't Pharaoh realize that he wasn't a god? It's just evidence of how much this set not just the Jews, but humanity on a journey to the fact that you can have one of the most successful movies of all time, which has these undertones of God against the gods, and we find it powerful and we find it convincing, and monotheism is a given, and everyone's just naturally rooting for God. There's something amazing about that, to the extent to which it may not have worked in its time. Right? The Egyptians may just have had to be killed, and they didn't quite internalize it. But the fact that it did leave an indelible impression on civilization in general. Okay, we have 60 seconds left. So, in 60 seconds, thank you so much for the last few weeks. I've had fun. I hope that sort of analyzing the movie, seeing what some of these scenes might look like, or how you might imagine them, has encouraged. I know it's encouraged me, but encouraged everyone to use a bit of our imagination to try to picture things in our heads in a way we wouldn't have, and try to look for the gaps in the stories, to try to figure out what things look like, develop the story, because it really is one of those things. We tell the story every year, and every year we need a new way to force us to reimagine and reinvest ourselves in the story, and not just tell it the way we've always told it, but sort of imagine it differently. So for me, this year, this was a lot of fun. And analyzing the movies and realizing that this is what they're doing, is picking up on gaps and picking up on cues and trying to imagine it and see what it would look like. Also,
that's what the Midrashim are also.
And that's what the Midrashim are doing, and to realize that movies, in a certain sense, is a Midrash. But also to realize that, going and sitting down at a computer and watching a few clips or rewatching the movie, sometimes words aren't enough to get us emotionally invested. But, a 20-second clip of God is God can, with the dramatic music and the set. Our goal when we get to the Seder is to feel like we left. And if whatever tools we have at our disposal to get us emotionally invested and get us our imagination invested for us and for our kids and our grandkids and whoever, right? To use every means we have, the text, our imagination, the imagination of the movie makers, is something I think, it's worth doing, because we're always looking for something to reignite that creativity in ourselves and everyone that we want in preparation for Pesach to be interested in. So for me, this was a fun experiment for the last few weeks. The last thing, so Chag Kasher v'Sameach, enjoy Pesach, and one second, Ray Turchiner sent me his topic for right after Pesach. It will